was a series of letters that were sent to a family immediately after buying a house in an affluent area of New Jersey, sort of near New York City. I actually don't know if it's in Westfield, New Jersey. I've never been there, so I don't know how close it is to New York City, but I think it's relatively close. Yeah. So the letters were extremely creepy, and I actually remember hearing about this while it was happening, like seeing it on the news. So, for Maria and Derek Broaddus, buying 657 Boulevard had fulfilled a dream. Maria was raised in the neighborhood, Westfield, New Jersey, like I said, with her childhood home only a few blocks away from their new house. Derek grew up working class in Maine, then moved his way up the ladder at an insurance company in Manhattan to become a senior vice president with a salary large enough to afford the $1.3 million house. The Broadduses had bought 657 Boulevard just after Derek celebrated his 40th birthday, and their 3 kids were already debating which of the house's fireplaces Santa Claus would use. Oh yeah, I want to add that I actually filmed this video last year, a version of this video, and I was going to upload it for like spooky season, last year, but I accidentally, when I imported it to iMovie and was editing it, I accidentally deleted the original file, because for some reason iMovie takes up like a huge amount of storage on my computer, like sometimes 50 gigabytes of data, so I always have to delete stuff to make room. I accidentally deleted the original video. No, I deleted the version of the video that I had edited. After fully editing an hour-long video, I accidentally deleted it. And so I had the original, which, this microphone goes straight to my camera, so the audio that I'm recording is with the video, but I used to, record with the microphone separately, because it's hard to get a microphone that has the jack that plugs into the camera. Most of them are like USB ones. So I'd record to like GarageBand and then add it into the video and delete the original audio in favor of the microphone audio. And I'd have to sync it up with the video. So I had the original video with the camera audio, and surprisingly the camera's built-in microphone is good enough to pick up like whispering, even though it's like, I don't know, 3 feet away from me right now. But there's a lot of like room noise, if you know what I mean, like that hissing sound that's in a video that's just like the sound of the room. I don't really know how to describe it. So I tried to like engineer the sound to make it better, and it did not work. It sounded really like tinny and weird, so I ended up having to delete it. So this is my second time making this video. Anyway, one night in June 2014, Derek Broaddus had just finished an evening of painting 657 Boulevard when he went outside to check the mail. My stomach was making noises. I don't know if the microphone picked that up or not. They had closed on the 6-bedroom house 3 days earlier and were doing some renovations before they moved in, so there wasn't much in the mail except a few bills and a white card-shaped envelope. It was addressed in thick, clunky handwriting to, quote, the new owner, and the typed note inside began warmly. Dearest new neighbor at 657 Boulevard, allow me to welcome you to the neighborhood. But the letter quickly took a turn. Quote, how did you end up here? The writer asked. Did 657 Boulevard call to you with its force within? The letter went on. 657 Boulevard has been the subject of my family for decades now, and as it approaches its 110th birthday, I have been put in charge of watching and waiting for its second coming. My grandfather watched the house in the 1920s, and my father watched in the 1930s. neighbors while their children, who were 5, 8, and 10 years old, and unnamed by the article for obvious reasons, ran around the backyard with several kids from the neighborhood. The letter writer seemed to have noticed. Quote, "You have children. I have seen them. So far I think there are 3 that I have counted." And then the anonymous letter writer went on to ask if there were, quote, "more on the way." They went on, quote, "Do you need to fill the house with the young blood I requested? Better for me. Was your old house too small for the growing family? Or was it greed to bring you my children? Greed to bring me your children. Once I know their names, I will call to them and draw them to me." They spelled "to" wrong. T-O-O instead of T-O. Who am I? There are hundreds and hundreds of cars that drive by 657 Boulevard each day. Maybe I am in one. Look at all the windows you can see from 657 Boulevard. Maybe I am in one. Look out any of the many windows in 657 Boulevard at all the people who stroll by each day. Maybe I am one. The letter concluded with a suggestion that this message would not be the last. Quote, "Welcome, my friends, welcome. Let the party begin." Followed by a signature typed in a cursive font, "The Watcher." It was after 10 p.m., and Derek was alone. He raced around the house, turning off lights so no one could see inside, then called the Westfield Police Department. An officer came to the house, read the letter, and said, quote, "What the fuck is this?" He asked Derek if he had enemies and recommended moving a piece of construction equipment from the back porch in case the Watcher decided to toss it through a window. The envelope the letter had come in had no return address, so there wasn't any immediate clue as to who the sender was. Derek rushed back to his wife and kids, who were living at their old home elsewhere in Westfield. That night, Derek and Maria wrote an email to John and Andrea Woods, the couple who had sold them 657 Boulevard, to ask if they had any idea who the Watcher might be, or why they had written, quote, "I asked the Woods to bring me young blood, and it looks like they listened." Andrea Woods replied the next morning. A few days before moving out, the Woodses had also received a letter from the Watcher. The note had been odd, she said, and made similar mention of the Watcher's family observing the house over time. But Andrea said she and her husband had never received anything like it in their 23 years in the house, and had thrown the letter away without much thought. That day, the Woodses went with Maria to the police station, where Detective Leonard Lugo told her not to tell anyone about the letters, including her new neighbors, most of whom she had never met, and all of whom were now suspects. The Broadduses spent the coming weeks on high alert. Derek canceled a work trip, and whenever Maria took the kids to their new house, she would yell their names if they wandered too far away. When Derek gave a tour of the renovation to a couple on the block, he froze when the wife said, quote, "It'll be nice to have some young blood in the neighborhood." The Broadduses' general contractor arrived one morning to find that a heavy sign he'd hammered into the front yard had been ripped out overnight. 2 weeks after the letter arrived, Maria stopped by the house to look at some paint samples and check the mail. She recognized the thick black lettering on a card-shaped envelope and called the police. Quote, "Welcome again to your new home at 657 Boulevard," the Watcher wrote. "The workers have been busy, and I have been watching you unload carfuls of your personal belongings. The dumpster is a nice touch. Have they found what's in the walls yet? In time they will." This time the Watcher had addressed Derek and Maria directly, misspelling their names as Mr. and Mrs. Braddis instead of Broaddus. Had the Watcher been close enough to hear one of the Broadduses' contractors addressing them? The Watcher boasted of having learned a lot about the family in the preceding weeks, especially about their children. The letter identified the Broadduses' 3 kids by birth order and by their nicknames, the ones Maria had been yelling. Quote, "I am pleased to know your names now, and the name of the young blood you have brought me," it said. You certainly say their names often." The letter asked about one child in particular, whom the writer had seen using an easel inside an enclosed porch. Quote, "Is she the artist in the family?" The letter went on, quote, 657 Boulevard is anxious for you to move and track you as you move through the house. Who am I? I am the Watcher, and I have been in control of 657 Boulevard for the better part of 2 decades now. The Woods family turned it over to you. It was their time to move on and kindly sold it when I asked them to. I pass by many times a day. 657 Boulevard is my job, my life, my obsession. And now you are too, Bradis family. Welcome to the product of your greed. Greed is what brought the past 3 families to 657 Boulevard, and now it has brought you to me. Have a happy moving in day. You know I will be watching. Derek and Maria stopped bringing their kids to the house. They were no longer sure when or if they would move in. Several weeks later, a 3rd letter arrived. Quote, "Where have you gone to?" the Watcher wrote. 657 Boulevard is missing you. Many Westfield residents compare their town to Mayberry, the idyllic setting for the Andy Griffith Show, the kind of place where a new neighbor might greet you with a welcoming note. Westfield is 45 minutes from New York, and a bit too slow for singles, meaning the town's 30,000 residents are largely well-to-do families. One year, Bloomberg ranked Westfield the 99th richest city in America, but only the 18th wealthiest in New Jersey. And in 2014, when the Watcher struck, the website Neighborhood Scout named it the country's 30th safest town. The most pressing local issues of late, according to residents, had been the temporary closure of Trader Joe's after a roof collapse and the rampant scourge of, quote, unconstitutional policing, by which they meant aggressive parking enforcement. One activity all locals recognize as treacherous is trying to buy a house. There's a lot of money and a lot of ego, one resident who requested anonymity before discussing Westfield real estate said. Quote, I have seen bidding wars where friends lost by 300,000. Schmidt, who lived 2 doors down, when Schmidt told him about the Langfords, who lived between them. Peggy Langford was in her 90s, and several of her adult children, all in their 60s, lived with her. The family was a bit odd, Schmidt said, but harmless. He described one of the younger Langfords, Michael, who didn't work and had a beard like Ernest Hemingway, as, quote, kind of a Boo Radley character. Derek thought the case was solved. The Langford house was right next to the easel on the porch. The family had lived there since the 1960s, when the Watcher's father, the letter said, had begun observing 657 Boulevard. Richard Langford, the family patriarch, had died 12 years earlier, and the current Watcher claimed to have been on the job for, quote, the better part of 2 decades. When the Broadduses told Lugo about the family, he said he already knew, and a week after the first letter arrived, he brought Michael Langford to police headquarters for an interview. Michael denied knowing anything about the letters, but the Broadduses say that Lugo told them that, quote, the narrative of what he said matched things mentioned in the letters. Quote, this isn't CSI Westfield, Lugo later told the Broadduses. When the wife is dead, it's the husband. But there wasn't much hard evidence, and after a few weeks the police chief told the Broadduses that, short of an admission, there wasn't much the department could do. Quote, this is someone who threatened my kids, and the police are saying, probably nothing's gonna happen, Derek said. Probably isn't good enough for me. After the second letter, Derek told the cops that if they didn't take care of the situation, they would have a different kind of case on their hands. Quote, this person attacked my family, and where I'm from, if you do that, you get your ass beat, Derek said. Frustrated, the Broadduses began their own investigation. Derek became especially obsessed. He set up webcams in 657 Boulevard and spent nights crouched in the dark, watching to see if anyone was watching the house at close range. Quote, Maria thought I was crazy, he said recently. At a coffee shop in Manhattan, where he covered a table with documents relating to the case, including copies of the letters, which he and his wife had shared with only a few friends and family members. He also had a map displaying when each of 657's neighbors had moved in. The Langfords were the only ones there since the 60s, with overlays marking possible sight lines for the easel and a circle for, quote, approximate range of earshot, to estimate who might have heard Maria yelling their kids' names. Only a few homes fit both criteria. The Broadduses also turned to several experts. They employed a private investigator who staked out the neighborhood and ran background checks on the Langfords, but didn't find anything noteworthy. Derek reached out to a former FBI agent who served as the inspiration for Clarice Starling in The Silence of the Lambs. They were on high alert. They were on high school board of trustees together, and they also hired Robert Lenahan, another former FBI agent, to conduct a threat assessment. Lenahan recognized several old-fashioned ticks in the letters that pointed to an older writer. The envelope was addressed to M/M Braddis. The salutations included the day's weather, quote, warm and humid, sunny and cool for a summer day, and the sentences had double spaces between them. The letters had a certain literary panache, which suggested a, quote, voracious reader, and a surprising lack of profanity given the level of anger, which Lenahan thought meant a, quote, less macho writer. Maybe, he wondered, the Watcher had seen The Watcher, starring Keanu Reeves as a serial killer who stalks the detective trying to catch him. Lenahan didn't think the Watcher was likely to act on the threats, but the letters had enough typos and errors to imply a certain erraticism. The first letter was dated Tuesday, June 4th, but that day was a Wednesday, as an example. There was also a seething anger directed at the wealthy in particular. The Watcher was upset by new money moving into town. Quote, are you one of those Hoboken transplants who are ruining Westfield? And by the Broadduses' relatively modest renovations. Quote, the house is crying from all the pain it is going through. You have changed it and made it so fancy. You are stealing its history. It cries for the past and what used to be in the time when I roamed its halls. With the wrong it's, IT apostrophe S instead of ITS. The 1960s were a good time for 657. 657 Boulevard when I ran from room to room, imagining the life with the rich occupants there. The house was full of life and young blood. Then it got old, and so did my father. But he kept watching until the day he died, and now I watch and wait for the day when the young blood will rule again, or when the young blood will be mine again, rather. Lenahan recommended looking into former housekeepers or their descendants. Perhaps the watcher was jealous that the Broadduses had bought a home that the writer themselves couldn't afford. But the focus remained on the Langfords. In cooperation with Westfield Police, the Broadduses sent a letter to the Langfords announcing plans to tear down the house, hoping to prompt a response. Nothing happened, though. Detective Lugo brought Michael Langford in for a second interview but got nowhere, and his sister Abby accused the police of harassing their family. Eventually, the Broadduses hired Lee Levitt, a lawyer, who met with several members of the Langford family, as well as their attorney, to show them the letters, along with photos explaining how their home was one of the few vantage points from which the easel could be seen. The meeting grew tense, Levitt said, and the Langfords insisted Michael was innocent. One night, Derek had a dream in which he confronted Peggy, the eldest Langford, and demanded she build an 8-foot fence between the properties. Maria was having other kinds of dreams. One night she woke up to an especially vivid one about a man who lived nearby. Quote, "He was wearing these boots and carrying a pitchfork and calling to the kids, and I couldn't get to them in time," Maria said. She thought almost anyone could be the watcher, which made daily life feel like navigating a labyrinth of threats. She probed the faces of grocery shoppers at Trader Joe's to see if they looked strangely at her kids, and spent hours Googling anyone who seemed suspicious. There were reasons to consider other suspects. For one thing, the police spoke to Michael before the second letter was sent, which would make sending 2 more especially reckless. The Broadduses say that Lugo told them they wouldn't receive any more letters after he spoke to Michael. Then there was the rest of the neighborhood to consider. The private investigator found 2 child sex offenders within a few blocks. Bill Woodward, the Broadduses' house painter, had also noticed something strange. The couple behind 657 Boulevard kept a pair of lawn chairs strangely close to the Broadduses' property. Quote, "One day I was looking out the window and I saw this older guy sitting in one of the chairs," Woodward said. "He wasn't facing his house, he was facing the Broadduses." But by the end of 2014, the investigation had stalled. The watcher had left no digital trail, no fingerprints, and no way to place someone at the scene of a crime that could have been hatched from pretty much any mailbox in northern New Jersey. The letters could be read closely for possible clues, or dismissed as the nonsensical ramblings of a sociopath. Quote, "It was like trying to find a needle in a haystack," said Scott Krause, who helped investigate the case for a Union County prosecutor's office. In December, the Westfield police told the Broadduses they had run out of options. Derek showed the letters to his priest, who agreed to bless the house. The renovations to 657 Boulevard, including a new alarm system, were finished within a few months, but the idea of moving in filled the Broadduses with overwhelming anxiety. Could they let their kids play outside or have friends over? Would they get a new letter every week? Derek priced out trained German shepherds and posted a job on a website for military veterans. Quote, "All you have to do is work out in the backyard every day." But the Broadduses hadn't bought 657 Boulevard to feel bunkered in a fortress. Quote, "We weren't going to put our kids in harm's way." Derek had been responding to occasional alarms at the house, sometimes in the middle of the night, bringing a knife with him just in case. Quote, "They were so joyous about their new home, and then within days they were petrified," Bill Woodward, the painter, said. Quote, "I'm a stranger, and Maria was crying and shaking in my arms." It didn't help that the watcher seemed to be getting more and more unhinged. Quote, 657 Boulevard is turning on me. It is coming after me. I don't understand why. What spell did you cast on it? It used to be my friend, and now it is my enemy. I am in charge of 657 Boulevard. It is not in charge of me. I will fend off its bad things and wait for it to become good again. It will not punish me. I will rise again. I will be patient and wait for this to pass and for you to bring the young blood back to me. to see a therapist after a routine doctor's visit that began with the question, "How are you?" caused her to burst into tears. The therapist said she was suffering post-traumatic stress that wouldn't go away until they got rid of the house. 6 months after the letters arrived, the Broadduses decided to sell 657 Boulevard. They initially listed it for more than they paid, to reflect the renovations they'd done. But few worlds are more gossipy than suburban New Jersey real estate, and rumors had already begun to swirl about why the house sat empty. One broker emailed to say that her client loved it, but that, quote, "there are so many unsubstantiated rumors flying around, ranging from sexual predator to stalker, that they needed to know more." The Broadduses sent a partial disclosure mentioning the letters to interested buyers and told Coldwell Banker, their realtor, that they intended to show the full letters to anyone whose offer was accepted. Several preliminary bids came in well below the asking price, but the Broadduses weren't ready to take such a financial hit and only wanted to share the letters with likely buyers. No one got that far, even after they lowered the price. A Coldwell agent who hadn't read the letters told them in an email that they were being unnecessarily forthcoming. Quote, "My friend got horrible threatening letters about her dog barking, and she didn't think to disclose." But the Broadduses insisted. Quote, "I don't know how you lived through what we did and think you could do it to somebody else," Derek said. "It's noble of them." Derek and Maria thought about what they would have done had the previous owners told them about their letter from the Watcher. The Woodses, both retired scientists, told the Broadduses that they remembered the letter they received as more strange than threatening, thanking them for taking care of the house. They say they never had any issues. Quote, "We certainly never felt watched," Andrea told them. "They rarely even locked the doors." But the Broadduses felt the name alone was ominous enough to merit mentioning to a new family moving in, and on June 2nd, 2015, a year after buying 657 Boulevard, they filed a legal complaint against the Woodses, arguing that the Woodses should have disclosed the letter just as they had the fact that water sometimes got in the basement. The Broadduses say they hoped to reach a quiet settlement. Their kids still didn't know about the Watcher, and their lawyer assured them that, at most, a small legal newswire might pick up the story. Quote, "We do some creepy stories," Tamara Hall said on the Today Show a few weeks later. "This might be top 10 creepy." A local reporter had found the complaint, which included snippets of the Watcher's menacing threats, and after a belated attempt by the Broadduses to seal it, the story went viral. News trucks camped out at 657 Boulevard, and one local reporter set up a lawn chair to conduct his own watch. The Broadduses got more than 300 media requests, but with advice from a crisis management consultant referred by one of Derek's colleagues, they decided not to speak publicly to spare their kids even more attention. They vacated Westfield and went to a friend's beach house. They didn't find much peace there, though. Maria's grandfather had a heart attack, and the friend they were staying with had a grand mal seizure. Eventually, Derek and Maria sat down with their children to explain the real reason they hadn't moved into their house. The kids had plenty of questions. Who is the Watcher? Where does this person live? Why is this person angry with us? To which Derek and Maria had few answers. Quote, "Can you imagine having that conversation with a 5-year-old, Derek said. Your town isn't as safe as you think it is, and there's a boogeyman obsessed with you. From a safer distance, the Watcher was a real-life mystery to solve. A commenter on NJ.com suggested ground-penetrating radar to find whatever the Watcher claimed was in the walls. The home inspector had already looked and told Derek that the only issue was the aging home's lack of insulation. A group of Reddit users obsessed over Google Maps Street View, which showed a car parked in front of 657 that one user thought had, quote, a man holding a camera in the driver's seat. Others more rationally saw pixelated glare. The range of proposed suspects included a jilted mistress, a spurned realtor, a local high schooler's creative writing project, guerrilla marketing for a horror movie, and, quote, mall goths having fun. Some people just thought the Broadduses were wimps for not moving in, which irked the Broadduses. Quote, none of them have read the letters or had their children threatened by someone they don't know, Derek said. To decide whether this person's only nuts enough to write these letters and not do something. What if something did happen? In Westfield, people were on edge. Laurie Clancy, who teaches piano lessons in her house behind 657 Boulevard, This was news to 657's neighbors, most of whom had never heard from the cops. Quote, "We are confounded as to how a thorough investigation can be conducted without talking to all the neighbors with proximity to the house." Several of them wrote in a letter to the local paper. Under the glare of national attention, Baron Chambliss, a veteran detective in the Westfield police, was asked to look into the case. Quote, "The Broadduses are victims, and I don't think that they got the support they needed," Chambliss, who has since retired, said recently of the initial investigation. Chambliss knew his colleagues had looked closely at Michael Langford. According to his brother, Sandy Langford, Michael had been diagnosed with schizophrenia as a young man. He sometimes spooked newcomers to the neighborhood when he did strange things, like walk through their backyard or peek into the windows of homes that were being renovated. But those who knew him said that the odd things he did were mostly just unusual neighborly kindness. Quote, "He goes out and gets the newspaper for me every morning," said John Schmidt, who lives next door. People who had known Michael for decades said they didn't think he was capable of writing the letters. As Chambliss looked into the case, he discovered something surprising. Investigators had eventually conducted a DNA analysis on one of the envelopes and determined that the DNA belonged to a woman. Chambliss decided to look more closely at Abby Langford, Michael's sister, who worked as a real estate agent. Was she upset about missing a commission right next door? She also worked at the local Lord & Taylor, and Chambliss coordinated with the security guard there to nab her a plastic water bottle during a shift. But Chambliss says the DNA sample was not a match. Not long after, the prosecutor's office gave Derek and Maria some unexpected news. They wouldn't say why or how, but they had ruled out the Langfords as suspects. The Broadduses were stunned. They had recently told the prosecutors that they planned to file civil charges against the Langfords, and wondered if the prosecutors were lying to prevent the story from blowing up again. Quote, "My family moved to the boulevard in 1961, and we never caused a problem for anybody," Sandy Langford said. "This guy gets all these letters, and all of a sudden, people are pointing fingers." Left without a suspect, the Broadduses reopened their personal investigation. They were still coy about sharing too much with their neighbors, who remained in the pool of suspects, but spent an afternoon walking the block with a picture of the watcher's handwritten envelope. They hoped someone might recognize the writing from a Christmas card, but the only notable encounter was when an older man who lived behind 657 said that his son joked that the watcher sounded a little bit like him. A neighbor across the street was the CEO of Kroll, the security firm, and the Broadduses hired the company to look for handwriting matches, but they found nothing. They also hired Robert Leonard, a renowned forensic linguist, who didn't find any noteworthy overlap when he scoured local online forums for similarities to the watcher's writing, although he did think the author might watch Game of Thrones because of the watchers on the wall. At one point, Derek persuaded a friend in tech to connect him to a hacker willing to try breaking into Wi-Fi networks in the neighborhood to look for incriminating documents, but doing so turned out to be both illegal and more difficult than the movies made it seem, so they didn't go through with it. Chambliss and the Westfield police were also back at square one. The cops asked Andrea Woods for a DNA sample and interviewed her 21-year-old son, who was surprised to find that he suddenly seemed to be a suspect. A year after the fact, it was hard to find fresh leads, and the initial police canvas had been so porous that it had missed a significant clue. Around the same time that the Broadduses had received their first letter, another family on the boulevard got a similar note from the watcher. The parents of that family had lived in their house for years, and their kids were grown, so they threw the letter away just as the Woodses had. But after the news broke, one of their children posted about it on Facebook, then deleted the post. When investigators spoke to the family, they confirmed that the letter had been similar to the Broadduses, but its existence only made the case more confusing. Quote, "There wasn't a whole lot to go on," Chambliss said. One night, Chambliss and a partner were sitting in the back of a van parked on Boulevard, watching the house through a pair of binoculars. Around 11 p.m., a car stopped in front of the house long enough for Chambliss to grow suspicious. He says he traced the car to a young woman in a nearby town, whose boyfriend lived on the same block as 657. The woman told Chambliss her boyfriend was into, quote, "some really dark video games, including, in Chambliss's memory, one in which he was playing a specific character, the Watcher." As for the female DNA, Chambliss figured the girlfriend or someone else could have helped. The boyfriend was living elsewhere the sale. Or Derek was cooking up some kind of insurance fraud. Or they were angling for a movie deal. The Broadduses received several offers but turned them down. Lifetime eventually released a movie called The Watcher, despite a cease and desist letter from the Broadduses, arguing that the couple in its movie was biracial and the letters were signed The Raven. Some locals found it noteworthy that over the course of a decade, the Broadduses had upgraded from a $315,000 house to a $770,000 house to a $1.3 million one and refinanced their mortgages. A few weeks after the letters became public, the Westfield Leader published an article in which anonymous neighbors were quoted asking why the Broadduses kept renovating a home they weren't moving into, or questioning whether they had really done that much renovating at all. Who cares? The Leader even cast doubt on Maria's commitment to her family's safety, citing as evidence the fact that she had a public Facebook page with a photo of her kids. God forbid. The paper did note that the police had tested Maria's DNA and it didn't match. None of the theories made much logical sense. The Broadduses had answers to every question. How does someone go from a $300,000 house to a $1.3 million house in 10 years? Derek said. It's America. But they weren't speaking publicly, and the rumors persisted. One Boulevard resident wrote a letter to the editor arguing that, quote, an elaborate scheme is underway to defraud the Woods family for millions of dollars. Chambliss said some Westfield cops even bought into the theory. There were even more skeptics online. Quote, I live in a neighboring town. If these letters have been happening for a while, there is no doubt in my mind that it would have been made public way before this, Lord Fluffernutter said on Reddit. This screams scam. The Broadduses hadn't known how their neighbors would react to the news about the Watcher, but they had lived in the area for a decade, and Maria's family had been a part of the community for much longer, so it was shocking to find themselves accused of being con artists. To Derek, it seemed that some in Westfield preferred the conspiracy theory to considering whether their own town might be home to a menace. Quote, there's a natural tendency to say, I've lived here for 35 years, nothing's happened to me. Derek said, what happened to my family is an affront to their contention that they're safe, that there's no such thing as mental illness in their community. People don't want to believe this could happen in Westfield. While Maria looks back fondly on her childhood, she was born a few years after Westfield resident John List infamously murdered his wife, mother, and 3 children in their home, and remembers a long period when she and other kids were warned to look out for a strange van driving around town. Quote, my mother always said don't have a false sense of security, Maria said. It wasn't that bad things were going on all the time, it was that bad things happen everywhere. She didn't want me to think that this is Mayberry. Many locals interviewed seemed more concerned that the national press might ruin Westfield's good name. Some were primarily worried about arson or vandalism, or whether the Broadduses would maintain the lawn, which they did. Mark Logrippo, the neighborhood's representative on the Westfield Town Council, said the primary concern he heard from residents was that they, quote, were worried about their property value and the stigma of the neighborhood. The Broadduses were suddenly outcasts, not only from their home, but also their town. Derek wanted to leave Westfield, but Maria insisted on not uprooting her kids. This person took so much from us, Maria said. I wouldn't let them take more. 2 years after the Watcher's letters arrived, the Broadduses borrowed money from family members to buy a second home in Westfield, using an LLC to keep the location private. But staying in town was stressful. The first time Maria let her daughter go to the pool with friends, she stared at the tracker on her daughter's iPhone the whole time. One of their kids was in a language arts class when the teacher led a debate about whether the family in a book they were reading should Terrorizes, through their attorney, declined to comment. Derek looked into renting the house to the Department of Veterans Affairs and a company that runs halfway homes. In the spring of 2016, they put 657 back on the market, hoping it might garner more interest, given how many people had reacted to the letters by saying they would have ignored them and just moved in. The Broadduses held a well-attended open house, after which Derek and Maria spent hours researching every person who signed in and comparing their handwriting to the watchers, but each time a potential buyer expressed interest and met with the Broadduses' lawyers to read the letters, they backed out. Quote, "Some cocky guy from Staten Island said, 'Fuck it, I'm gonna get a house at a discount,'" Derek recalled. "He reads the letters and we never hear from him again." Feeling as if they were out of options, the Broadduses' real estate lawyer proposed an idea: sell the house to a developer who could tear it down and split the property into 2 sellable homes. They thought they could get $1 million for the lot. Subdivisions like this had become common in Westfield, much to the chagrin of many locals, and 657 was one of the neighborhood's largest lots. Even so, dividing it would require the Westfield Planning Board to grant an exception, because the 2 smaller lots would be 67.4 and 67.6 feet wide, which was just shy of the mandated 70 feet. When the proposal was publicly announced, Westfield's Facebook groups lit up. Some expressed sympathy for the Broadduses, while others pointed out real estate is always a gamble. Yeah, but not for this reason. Another faction was convinced that this was the culmination of a long con. Quote, "Out of this whole scam artist story, there ends up being nothing more disturbing than this move," a local woman said. "What, the move to sell the house for less money than they bought it for? Like, what?" A man who coached the Broadduses' son in football wrote, quote, "They were in over their heads from day one." The application was jarring for the neighbors who had learned about the watcher from a lawsuit and had always found it strange that the Broadduses didn't share more information, not seeming to understand that they were following orders from the police and trying to protect their kids. And people are already running their mouths so much, if the Broadduses were talking about it more, that wouldn't solve the problem. When the planning board met to decide the application in January 2017, it had already devoted a 3-hour hearing to the issue. More than 100 residents showed up. One of them, who lived across the street and had a daughter in the same grade as one of the Broadduses' kids, had retained a lawyer to fight the proposal. Damn, what a bunch of Karens, am I right? After a quick discussion about a Wells Fargo branch that wanted to use brighter light bulbs than the town allowed, the room grew tense as suburban planning board meetings get. James Forrest, the Broadduses' attorney, explained that the 3-foot exemption was as narrow as the easel he was using to display a map of the neighborhood, a map that showed several lots on the block that were also too small. The neighbors expressed I don't know why I can't talk tonight. The neighbors expressed concern that the plan might require knocking down trees and that the new homes would have aesthetically unpleasing front-facing garages. Since when are front-facing garages that big of a deal? The lawyer repeatedly threatened the halfway house as a possible alternative. After the lawyers, a parade of neighbors stood to speak. Glenn Dumont, from across the street, said the proposal, quote, "would spell the end of the 600 block of Boulevard as we know it." Overdramatic. A woman whose kids had been to the Broadduses' old home for a birthday party spoke on behalf of 9 neighbors and presented 657 Boulevard as Westfield's Alamo. Quote, "Our neighborhoods are constantly under attack from turf, lights, parking decks, you name it," she said. How terrible. If we can't make a stand on Boulevard, where can we? At one point Higgins pointed out that there was no guarantee the watcher wouldn't send letters to the two new houses and argued that aesthetics should rule the day. Quote, putting up two houses there is going to stick out like an old client of mine in Texas said, Higgins said. Quote, it's going to stick out like a dog's balls. While some of the neighbors expressed compassion, their focus remained on what the Broadduses stood to gain financially and what they themselves might lose. At 11:30 p.m., the board unanimously rejected the proposal. A New Jersey judge later denied the Broadduses' appeal of the decision. Derek and Maria were distraught. Even if the plan had gone through, it would have only staunched their financial bleeding. On top of the mortgage and renovations, they had paid about $100,000 in Westfield property taxes. The town denied their request for relief and spent at least that amount investigating the watcher and exploring ways to deal with the home, not to mention cleaning the gutters. The Broadduses recognized that 657 Boulevard was a beautiful house. I don't know about that. On a beautiful street that was worth maintaining, but were surprised their neighbors didn't see the uniqueness of the situation. This is my town, Maria said recently. I grew up here. I came back. I chose to raise my kids here. You know what we've been through. You had the ability 2.5 years into a nightmare to make it a little better, and you have decided that this house is more important than we are. That's really how it felt. On top of all that, her dad had recently died unexpectedly as well. Father Michael Saporito, the priest who blessed the house, went to one of the planning board meetings and said he was taken aback by how many people had come up to him and said they thought the whole thing was a hoax. Quote, I think the human element of the story was kind of lost on the neighbors, Saporito said. The watcher had expressed a desire to protect the boulevard from change, but instead it had been torn apart. Not long after the planning board's decision, the Broadduses got some good news. A family with grown children and 2 big dogs had agreed to rent 657 Boulevard. The renter told the Star-Ledger he wasn't worried about the watcher, though he had a clause in the lease that let him out in case of another letter. 2 weeks later, Derek went to 657 to deal with squirrels that had taken up residence in the roof. The renter handed him an envelope that had just arrived. Quote, violent winds and bitter cold, to the vile and spiteful Derek and his wench of a wife, Maria. This letter, 2.5 years after the watcher appeared, came out of nowhere. It was dated February 13th, the day the Broadduses gave depositions in their lawsuit against the Woodses. Quote, you wonder who the watcher is? Turn around, idiots, the letter read. Maybe you even spoke to me, one of the so-called neighbors who has no idea who the watcher could be. Or maybe you know and are too scared to tell anyone. Good move. The letter was less stylish and more wrathful than the others, and it seemed the writer had been closely following the story. They had seen the media coverage. Quote, I walked by the news trucks when they took over my neighborhood and mocked me. Derek's surreptitious investigatory efforts. Quote, I watched as you watched from the dark house in an attempt to find me. Telescopes and binoculars are wonderful inventions. In the attempt to tear down the house, quote, 657 Boulevard survived your attempted assault and stood strong with its army of supporters barricading its gates. My soldiers of the boulevard followed my orders to a T. They carried out their mission and saved the soul of 657 Boulevard with my orders. All hail the watcher. The renter was mentioned. He was spooked but agreed to stay if the Broadduses installed cameras around the house, and the letter indicated revenge could come in many forms. Quote, maybe a car accident, maybe a fire, maybe something as simple as a mild illness that never seems to go away, but makes you feel sick day after day, after day, after day, after day. Maybe the mysterious death of a pet. Loved ones suddenly die. Planes and cars and bicycles crash. Bones break. Quote, it was like we were back at the beginning, said Maria. But it also meant fresh evidence that might help invigorate the investigation. Derek took the letter to the police headquarters, where a detective looked at a neighborhood map and traced a circle around the house, 300 yards in diameter, suggesting the watcher places, 657 Boulevard. But these were bits of information that could mean everything or nothing depending on how hard you looked at them. The Broadduses sent new names to the investigators whenever they found something odd, but their greatest fear was that the watcher could be someone they'd never suspect. The Broadduses no longer live in ever-present fear that the watcher might strike at any moment, but they continue to deal with lingering effects from the letters. They have a new tenant at 657, but the rent doesn't cover the mortgage. Their kids are occasionally teased at school, and the conspiratorial rumors persist. They try to avoid the people who spoke out against their planning board application or accused them of being con artists, but suburban life makes that impossible. I see these people on the soccer field, at the train station rather, and my heart starts going like it did when I played hockey and was about to get into a fight, Derek said. When Maria found herself in a spin class at the YMCA with the head of the planning board, she went up afterward and told him, quote, "You continue to hurt my family every day." Earlier this year, the planning board approved splitting a lot around the corner that required an even larger exception than the Broadduses. Most people in Westfield said they rarely thought of the watcher anymore. The real estate market was doing fine, for one, and many were surprised to find out the Broadduses were still dealing with the problem. Hindsight made Derek and Maria wonder if they should have sold the house at a loss early on, and 657 Boulevard conjured too much emotional pain for them to ever consider moving in. They hope that a few years of renting the place without incident will help them sell it. The prosecutor's office was continuing its investigation, but the Broadduses knew it was unlikely the watcher would ever be caught, and that the legal punishment would likely be minimal. The watcher was also no longer the only person sending anonymous letters in Westfield. Last Christmas Eve, several families received an envelope in their mailboxes. They'd been delivered by hand to the homes of people who had been the most vocal in criticizing the Broadduses online. One of them, who lived just a few blocks down on Boulevard, had written on Facebook, quote, "I wish we could go back to the days of tar and feathers. I have just the couple in mind." Another family who got the letter said it was, quote, "weirdly poetic, as the watchers had been, and that it accused the families of speculating inaccurately about the Broadduses. It included several stories about recent acts of domestic terrorism, in which signs of brewing mental illness had gone unnoticed. The typed letters were signed, quote, 'Friends of the Broaddus family.'" The letter writer had clearly been infected with not only the watcher's penchant for anonymous notes, but also a simmering resentment, one that had sneaked its way through Westfield, making enemies of neighbors. The people who received the letters didn't know who sent them, but the tone had a familiar ring to the interviewer who wrote this article. He wasn't proud of it. He hadn't even told his wife, and said they were the only anonymous letters he'd written. Derek wrote them. But he had felt driven to his wits' end, fed up with watching silently as people threw accusations at his family based on practically nothing. One of the people who received the letter said they had never met the Broadduses and had no interest in doing so. The watcher had been obsessed with 657 Boulevard, and Derek in turn had become obsessed with the watcher and everything the letters had set in motion. Quote, "It's like cancer," he said. "We think about it every day." Part of the fourth letter from the watcher sums it up. Quote, "You were despised by the house, and the watcher won." So there was a follow-up article written in 2002, 4 years after the original one. In March 2019, 5 years after the Broadduses paid more than $1.35 million for 657 Boulevard, they put it back on the market at a steep discount, $999,000. Their preference was to sell it to a builder who wanted to tear the house down. Eventually, a young family in town agreed to buy it for $959,000, a loss of roughly $400,000 even before factoring in the agent's cut, who happened to be the same agent who sold the house to the Broadduses in 2014, which is a little ironic, as well as the $100,000 in property taxes the Broadduses had paid, and the bills for utilities, home insurance, the contractors who had begun making renovations to the home, and the lawyers and private investigation they had hired to find a solution to the mystery. When the sale closed, the Broadduses asked their real estate attorney to give a note to the new owners. Quote, "We wish you nothing but peace and quiet that we once dreamed of in this house," they wrote. They attached a photograph of the watcher's handwriting in case any new letters showed up. So far, they haven't. In 2015, the mayor of Westfield described the police department's investigation as exhaustive, prosecuted the case a year after the incident took place, was blunt in his critique. Quote, "I'm not Sam Spade, but the Westfield Police Department fucked these people's case up." Eventually, the case was turned over to the Union County Prosecutor's Office, which started its investigation from scratch. This is not necessarily a case the prosecutor's office would be involved in. Vince Gagliardi, the former chief of detectives for the prosecutor's office, said recently, "Our lane is homicide, narcotics, financial crimes, not this stalking stuff." By 2018, the office had put considerable resources into the investigation, but without fresh evidence or new leads, they had largely stopped working on the case. A few weeks after the original article was published, the prosecutor's office decided to try one more new idea. A forensic investigation had found saliva on the underflap of one of the envelopes, and subsequent DNA analysis determined that the letter was apparently licked shut by a woman. Several early suspects had been ruled out by DNA samples that didn't match. In December 2018, the prosecutor's office canvassed the neighborhood again. This time, it decided to ask everyone on the block to voluntarily submit DNA samples for comparison. A month later, the Broadduses were called to a meeting at the prosecutor's office in Elizabeth, New Jersey. The Broadduses were told that, by and large, the neighbors were cooperative. No one was eager to appear suspicious, but none of the swabs had matched the sample from the envelope. The Broadduses begged to know more. How many people had given samples? Who had been ruled out? Several people on the block later said they weren't home during the canvass. And according to a person close to the investigation, 2 people refused to have their cheeks swabbed, at least one of whom was, quote, a close neighbor of 657 Boulevard and someone the police had considered as a suspect, but the prosecutor's office declined to elaborate. The Broadduses pitched one more idea: forensic genealogy. The emerging and controversial field involves using the DNA that millions of people have uploaded in pursuit of genetic and ancestral enlightenment in order to triangulate criminal suspects through their relatives. Some researchers believe that roughly 90% of Americans of European descent can now be identified based on DNA uploaded to these databases. Westfield is 82% white, for reference. The technique had been used in an increasing number of cold cases, and Derek connected with a company that was willing to take a look at the case if the prosecutor's office would share the DNA. But the prosecutor rejected the idea, arguing that the office had never used the technology before and could not justify doing so for a family that received a few threatening letters when it had unsolved murders and rapes to deal with. The Broadduses offered to cover the costs of using the technique on their case and several of those cases, but got nowhere. They were told that, in the absence of new evidence, there wasn't much more to do. Quote, "We lose again," Derek said. The prosecutor's office declined to comment on the case, saying that while the investigation isn't active, it isn't closed. After the canvass, an anonymous writer sent an email to several local officials. Quote, "What gives the authority of the prosecutor's office to go door to door and demand DNA samples of residents without a warrant or judge's order?" The author, who identified himself as Malcolm Mannix, wrote, "Even if the watcher is caught, what laws will they be charged with and what jail time will they really face? Is this the best use of the prosecutor's resources?" Mannix's answer to the last question, quote, "Pursuing illegal aliens." I feel like that's not the best use either. Who is Malcolm Mannix? There wasn't anyone with that name in Westfield. Mannix was a TV show that first aired in the 1960s, in which Lieutenant Art Malcolm helps private detective Joe Mannix solve crimes, which meant that someone near 657 Boulevard, who appeared to have a working knowledge of 60s pop culture, had written an anonymous email complaining about an attempt to unmask the watcher. Several messages to Mannix's email address bounced back. The most intriguing new theory involved a local teacher. For 33 years, Robert Kaplow taught English at Summit High School, 2 towns over from Westfield. Kaplow built a career as a writer and was best known for short comic bits he performed on NPR under the name Mo Moskowitz of Mo Moskowitz and the Punsters, for his 2003 novel, Me and Orson Welles, which Richard Linklater adapted into a movie. The novel is started sending letters to the Broadduses. And while Robert had moved out of Westfield, his brother Richard was still there. He lived a half block from 657 Boulevard and worked as an attorney in town. In fact, when the Broadduses sued the Woods family, alleging that they should have disclosed the letter they'd received from the Watcher, the Woodses were represented by Richard Kaplow. Quote, "There's nothing there," Robert said recently after I relayed the speculation of the AP English rumor mill. He said that he was familiar with the accusation. He had read about it on Wikipedia. In 2020, a user updated Kaplow's page with a paragraph detailing the evidence. An editing war ensued. The insinuation was removed as defamatory, then reinstated and deleted and reinserted several more times. Last year, a user in New Jersey declared, quote, "Due to the circumstantial evidence, one person who continually edits Kaplow's Wikipedia page believes that Robert Kaplow is the Watcher." Kaplow admitted that he had written letters to a house in Westfield, and as the students recalled, but the house wasn't 657 Boulevard. He said it was a Victorian on the north side of town, and the letters were admiring, not threatening. He eventually befriended the family who lived there. They even let him house sit once. So, who is the Watcher? Most of the professional detectives who have looked at the case agree on a few things. The Watcher most likely lived near 657 Boulevard, and they were probably an older person. Much of the initial investigation focused on members of two families who lived immediately around 657 Boulevard and fit the profile. The Broadduses were told that the DNA samples obtained from several of these suspects weren't a match. Of course, DNA evidence isn't foolproof, but short of a match, there isn't much hope for a resolution other than a confession. In the past few years, several of the early suspects have died. As far as the idea that the Broadduses did it, even people who recognize the theory's implausibility still seem titillated by the notion, but it makes no logical sense. If this was a nefarious plot, it was ill-conceived in a spectacular way, to no clear practical end, with only the result being the self-sabotage of years of the Broadduses' lives. Quote, "Maria was distraught every time I saw her. She was shaking," Vince Gagliardi, who investigated the case for the prosecutor's office, said, quote, "I can tell you this, if Maria Broaddus was faking, she should play herself in the movie." Do people in town still care? Westfield has a history of embracing its scary side. Pretty much everyone I spoke to in town asked me if I knew about John List, who'd murdered his wife, mother, and 3 children at their home in Westfield in 1971. And that month, the town kicked off its 5th annual Adams Fest in honor of Westfield native Charles Adams, who'd used a Victorian house in town as the model homestead for his cartoon family of misfits and monsters. A day after the Watcher adaptation is to be released on Netflix, downtown Westfield will host Morticia and Gomez's Masquerade Ball. But unlike the Adams family, this case was real, and unlike List's victims, the Broadduses still live in Westfield. As the locals were surveyed, plenty of sympathy was found for the family and what they had been through, but a surprising number of people seemed to harbor resentment about all the attention the case had brought to the town, or still believed the Broadduses had done this themselves. Quote, "The Charles Adams thing, all that haunted house bullshit, it's used to bring people together," Gagliardi said. "With the Watcher, there is nothing I've ever seen in this town as polarizing as this. Everybody's got an opinion." Gagliardi lives in Westfield, and while he didn't know the Broadduses well, he and Maria had served on the kindergarten parent-teacher organization together. He retired in 2019 and declined to discuss details of the investigation on the record, but when he was spoken to recently, he said that a memory of the town's treatment of the Broadduses came rushing back and made him, quote, "absolutely furious." In January 2019, while the prosecutor's office was still sorting through its DNA canvas, Gagliardi attended a swearing-in of Westfield's new police chief. Beforehand, the town board had announced that it would be giving out awards in Westfield's annual holiday gingerbread house contest. Gagliardi was shocked as he watched the first prize in iconic building category go to a rendition of 657 Boulevard, complete with the Watcher's letters sitting on the front porch. Quote, "I'm saying to myself, if I'm the Broadduses, do I really think that Westfield is taking this seriously?" Gagliardi said. He seemed more upset by what happened next, when the new police chief stood up to give a speech. Quote, "In front of a packed hall, he thanks me for coming. Quote, even though you and your office can't solve the Watcher case," Gagliardi said. Everybody laughed except him. Quote, "We had all these drag-out meetings with the Broadduses, and my office was giving everything we possibly could," Gagliardi said. "You can't say we're taking this seriously as a community, then have Broadduses still live in Westfield in a lovely, albeit smaller, house. Derek admits to having a difficult time getting beyond his obsession with the case and what it did to their lives. Quote, I had just turned 40 when we bought the house, he joked a few years ago. I'm now 93 years old. But the Broadduses try to avoid thinking or talking about the Watcher, which only adds stress. They prefer to move on and have turned down offers to go on just about every television network, and declined interest from documentarians hoping to try and solve the case, not wanting to put their lives on camera. And as far as the Netflix adaptation goes, pretty much everyone viewed in Westfield believes the Broadduses made a killing by giving Netflix the right to adapt their story. One neighbor said she'd heard the Broadduses pocketed close to $10 million. In reality, the money from Netflix didn't even cover their losses on the house. In 2018, a number of major film and TV producers expressed interest in acquiring the rights to adapt the original article in the Broadduses' life story. One horror producer offered to buy 657 Boulevard, hoping to use the house as a set. The Broadduses had little interest in giving someone the right to make a piece of entertainment out of the worst years of their life. Selling the rights offered a modicum of control, although the Broadduses wanted a little involvement. They made only 2 requests and a suggestion to the production team that the show not use their name, that the on-screen family look as little like theirs as possible. Naomi Watts and Bobby Cannavale have 2 kids rather than 3, and that they wouldn't mind it if the fictional house burned to the ground. The Broadduses have not seen the show. Derek doesn't plan